Good evening. A warm welcome on behalf of the Theosophical Society Point Loma. We begin a new series tonight, H.P. Blavatsky's role in transforming the world mentality. And the first lecture in that series is titled The Spiritual Heart of Every Being. Anyone who has thought about it knows that it's not easy to change your own mindset, let alone that of the world. How do we strike that new tone in world thinking? Why is it extremely difficult to change the thinking climate? One of the masters of wisdom and compassion gives valuable information about this. In a letter to A.P. Synod, he responds to Synod's request for occult information. The master says, "The occult science is not one in which secrets can be communicated of a sudden by written or even verbal communication. If so, all the brothers," and the brothers was a name used in the early days of the Theosophical Society to refer to the masters, if so, all the brothers should have to do would be to publish a handbook of the art which might be taught in schools as grammar is. End quote. In one generation, we could then spread our theosophical ideas. Now we are 150 years later, and we must note that a great deal of the theosophical thought is not yet widely known, let alone accepted. The master goes even deeper into the subject in his letter to Synod. He asserts that it is simply impossible to communicate certain ideas, a certain truth, to people who are unprepared. Some secrets cannot be shared unless a person has created the conditions within himself to receive those truths. The master expressed it this way. He says, the receptivity must be equal to the desire to instruct. The illumination must come from within. And you can immediately see the enormous difficulty that the pioneers of the Theosophical movement had to try to solve before they could transmit anything of Theosophical thought. Is that also the essence of the parable of the sower sowing seed? Some seeds fall into fertile soil and germinate and bear fruit. Other seeds fall on the rocks and nothing happens. And the question then is, how does our consciousness become fertile soil so that the thought seed of Theosophia can take root in it? Where do we find the spiritual manure to make that soil fertile in our consciousness? The master in the quoted letter mentions some things such as fasting, meditation, discipline of thought, discipline of word and deed, silence, control of animal impulses, and above all, utter selflessness. Since time immemorial, he says, and I think for 18 million years, because that's when our thinking was awakened, these ethical principles and practical matters have never been kept secret. And indeed, there is no difference in ethics among the major religions and philosophies. All point in the direction of selflessness and personal love, disciplined thinking, an open attitude that does not immediately disapprove or approve of something, but evaluates thoughts on their own merit. In such a mind, new thought can take root. Indeed, a thought or an idea is born just like any being. There's always a gradual process. No one is born immediately possessing his physical, psychic, mental, and spiritual powers. It usually takes 21 years to grow up. And those inner qualities emerge cyclically from our consciousness and become active again in life. Now, it may seem strange to compare a thought to a human being, but a thought is also a living being, a very unself-conscious being. It is at the very bottom of the hierarchical ladder of consciousness, but it is nevertheless a living entity. It's born just like any other being. It can grow and can die. Do our course Universal Wisdom, in which this whole process of how thoughts are born is explained. In fact, a thought being has the same spiritual core, the same spiritual heart as a human being. Now, it may seem contradictory that a thought has a spiritual heart, while nevertheless, it is at the very bottom of the hierarchical ladder of consciousness. But nevertheless, it is an essentially divine being, and this should give us considerable food for thought. For it is this idea of a spiritual heart of all beings that can radically change our way of looking at things. And as a result, the soil of our consciousness is transformed into fertile soil for theosophical ideas, soil in which the theosophical seed of thought can germinate and bear abundant fruit. And therefore, let us dwell on that spiritual core. And we can best explain this by first dwelling on the three basic principles, the three fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine. The secret doctrine, that tremendous book of H.P. Blavatsky. We present them here in abbreviated form. The first one, boundlessness and infinity. The second, cyclicity. The third cannot be expressed in a single word. It deals with the hierarchic structure of any universe. So every universe has a summit, a top. It's called the oversoul in this proposition. And every being in a particular universe is a ray of the oversoul of that universe. And furthermore, this third proposition states that there is progressive evolution for every being, and the universal laws apply everywhere. We summarize the latter with as above, so below. From these three propositions, the following picture emerges. There is an unlimited, boundless space, not a space, but space itself. In the boundless space, the worlds, the beings appear and disappear. Every world, every cosmos is a hierarchy. That is, it consists of area, spheres, worlds that becomes less and less ethereal, and thus coarser and coarser. And there is a being at the head of every cosmos. When a cosmos comes into being, there is a majestic collaboration between all beings. The second fundamental proposition, that of cyclicity, teaches that the moment the universe appears in boundless space, at the beginning of a birth process, all kinds of beings work together. Highly developed beings, moderately developed beings, and less developed beings, they cannot exist without each other. Just as a human being cannot manifest without the help of, or rather, without the cooperation with the trillions of atoms and cells that make up his body, and the hundreds of thousands of thoughts he thinks. In the same way, for example, the solar system cannot manifest unless it works closely with other beings, with the planets, with the inhabitants of those planets, and so on and so on. Everything is alive. Everything works together. We live in a living universe. And the universe is not only what we can perceive with our eyes and our instruments. No, it's much, much more. The more advanced beings, we call them the spiritual or divine side of life, work together with the less advanced beings. We call them the material side. But matter is alive. Everything is alive. Everything exists in and through and with each other. All living beings are related to all other living beings. You cannot live separately. You cannot exist as an isolated being. Think about it. You can easily verify this for yourself. Now, when you reflect on these three propositions, and this is a process that takes time, perhaps many years, then the idea of the spiritual heart of every being becomes clear to you. If we imagine boundlessness as an infinite cosmic fire that burns forever, we imagine a being as a spark of that fire. In the Secret Doctrine, H.P. Blavatsky speaks of sparks of eternity. But actually, this metaphor is not quite correct, because when you think of a spark, then it looks like it is separate from the fire, and it hasn't. Rather, it is a flame from the eternal fire. But it's only a metaphor, and as H.P. Blavatsky herself says, any comparison in human language does not suffice. We ourselves often use the metaphor of the drop in the ocean. But here again, the drop, or indeed every being, from firefly to Milky Way, from plant to supergod, always remains part of that boundless ocean of being. Actually, you could even better compare it to a ripple or a vortex in that ocean, because its core is that ocean. Or to use the metaphor of fire, its core is that cosmic fire. Every drop in that ocean, or every spark of fire, is called a monad. Later, we will go deep into those monads. It were these fundamental thoughts that should change the world mentality. That was the main message of the hierarchy of compassion and its representative, Helena Blavatsky. When she arrived in New York in 1873, she spoke the following words: "I have come to break the molds of mind." It are those molds of thought, molds of mind, people's ingrained patterns of thought that must be broken if new ideas are to take hold. Now, what a person thinks, and this may sound strange, is not just a private matter. When we think a thought, we also transmit an impulse, a thought seed. Humans are senders and receivers of thoughts simultaneously. Other human beings can pick up on that thought and in turn pass it on. Thoughts like bacteria or viruses can spread very quickly, especially when people do not control their thinking. Then they are passive transmitters of ideas. Thus all the people of this planet collectively create a certain sphere, a world of thought, a mental sphere, the world mentality. And this is not a metaphor. In one of his letters, the master speaks of a continent of thought. It's an actual existing sphere belonging to the astral realm. That is an area more ethereal than our material world, and therefore it cannot be measured with our measuring instruments. But we do experience that atmosphere. Enter a house where there has just been a big argument. You notice that immediately. Or go to a place where there are many unselfish, kind, humble people. It's then much easier to think certain spiritual thoughts than when you walk into a big department store where there is just a sale. Thoughts, our mental energies, create an atmosphere in which we all dwell. And depending on how you have attuned your own thinking, because we don't have to be influenced by everything and everyone, you can, for example, think certain thoughts, take certain ideas for true. Ideas rule the world, Plato said. What did that sphere of thought look like in the 19th century when H.P. Blavatsky began her work? That century was a century of revolutions in which the map of Europe was rewritten. A century in which materialism and atheism rose sharply, but where the church still remained supreme and stubbornly clung to its dogmas. Where the freethinkers, the atheists, said that everything was matter, that man's soul was a figment of the brain, man had no soul, they claimed. There the church held to the outdated idea as if the Lord God created the universe in 6 days and the 7th day was the day of rest. And for every man on earth who was born, a new soul was created. There was tremendous dogmatism in both camps. The church rejected everything that deviated from its dogmas, even though there was scientific evidence that a particular doctrine could not possibly be true. The argument was always raised then that the ways of God are unfathomable. But even in the scientific world, there was little or no room for anything other than the materialistic view. Darwinism, especially Darwin's followers, believed that they knew the origin of life. Physics had reached its limits, was the idea. In the 19th century, parents advised their sons against studying physics. Daughters were not allowed to study anyway, because everything was already discovered and known. Only a group of spiritualists, at least, recognized that there was more between earth and heaven. If you look at this mental climate from the 19th century, it was a narrow, rigid mentality in which there was hardly any room for ethics. In some countries, slavery had not even been abolished when the Theosophical Society was founded. Equality among people, let alone the idea of universal brotherhood, was not very popular, despite the French Revolution with its liberty, equality, and fraternity. There is a very interesting letter from the Maha-Chohan, the master of the masters, or actually it's not a letter from him, but from Master Kuthumi, who in that letter reflects the vision of the Maha-Chohan. He says, The intellectual portion of mankind seems to be fast dividing into two classes. The one unconsciously preparing for itself long periods of temporary annihilation or states of non-consciousness, owing to the deliberate surrender of their intellect, its imprisonment in the narrow grooves of bigotry and superstition, a process which cannot fail to lead to the utter deformation of the intellectual principle. Aren't these the believers, the religious fanatics, who, although they could and should know better, cling to the dogmas of the church devoid of any logic, to believe in miracles, believe in the devil, in angels, and that God forgives all your sins, and to the idea that only they, and only they, nobody else, only they have the truth. Then the other group, the other, unrestrainedly indulging its animal propensities with the deliberate intention of submitting to annihilation, pure and simple in cases of failure, to millenniums of degradation after physical dissolution. Aren't these the ones who deny everything, who indulge in their pleasures, in parties with whiskey, wine, lots of food, hunting parties, their wealth and insane luxury, with no regard for the poverty of the masses? And although pleasures may have changed in the 21st century, the mindset is still prevalent among many of us. And then the Maha-Chohan continues. Those intellectual classes reacting upon the ignorant masses which they attract and which look up to them as noble and fit examples to follow, degrade and morally ruin those they ought to project and guide. Between degrading superstition and even more degrading animal materialism, the white dove of truth can barely find a resting place for tired, unwelcome ideas. What a keen overview, how it still applies, because even now the masses look up to those leaders of the world, and I don't need to mention any names, I guess. Still no inspiring influence emanates from them. Still in no way is man's ethical instinct appealed to. On the contrary, it's selfishness and nothing more than selfishness. It's me, me, me. It's our country, our culture, our prosperity. It is the leading figures of our world, politicians, the directors of large corporations, the tech companies, some scientists who exert great influence on the climate of thought and thus on large groups of people who do not think self-consciously and tend to follow authorities. It's time, says the Maha-Chohan, that Theosophy should enter the arena. In other words, it will have to be Theosophy, the spirit of truth, that must ultimately overcome both illusory schools of thought, not by fighting them. We shouldn't waste our energy on that, but by opposing the light of truth to it, and in particular, the idea about the essential divinity of each being. That's how you change the world mentality. When the Maha-Chohan made his vision known to a synod through Master Kuthumi in 1882, H.P. Blavatsky had already entered the arena. As an extension, as a vehicle of the Maha-Chohan and the Masters, indeed, of the entire hierarchy of compassion, she was sent into the wilderness. And the first major achievement was to found the Theosophical Society in 1875. If you really want to introduce certain ideas into the thinking climate of humanity, you need a group, a core, a nucleus of people who have roughly the same goal, people who form that nucleus of brotherhood. We said it before, thoughts are living beings fed by the human thinking faculty. As more people think a certain type of thought and exchange it with each other, it becomes stronger, more visible to others, so to speak, so that it can spread more easily. You see that collaboration between devoted souls very clearly in the creation of the secret doctrine. And of course, the masters and H.P. Blavatsky, as their scribe, wrote that book. But there are many people to whom H.P.B. asked for their comments. And when all the manuscripts of the secret doctrine were collected in London, it was of 1 meter pile, uncle and cousin Keatley, faithful co-workers, were given the task of reading it through and organizing it all. If you read the booklet At the Source of the Occult Tradition by Boris Zirkov, you see how many times they retyped the entire manuscript, provided new commentaries, went to HPB to propose a new format. And then she often gave us an answer, flap-doodle, go to hell. But a little later, she was back at her desk. She worked incessantly. The Keatleys felt that there was still too little commentary on the stanzas to Elena Blavatsky. They were crystal clear. And they passed each sloka, each verse of the stanzas on a white paper, and sometimes included their questions, and HPB wrote a commentary. My point is, there was cooperation, that Helena Blavatsky did not feel too proud to consider the comments of others, although, of course, she herself, or rather the masters, always had the final responsibility. It's also important that to that team, to that nucleus of brotherhood, belong all kinds of people. The Theosophical Society is not an elitist hobby club, or to put it in the words of the master of the masters, there must be a beneficial, mutual union of high and low, of the Alpha and the Omega. And in doing so, he says, the white race must be the first to stretch out the hand of fellowship to the dark nations. He's referring in particular to the British, the colonizers of India, who held their own culture and religion far higher than that of the Indians. But you can also take this very broadly. Those in power must promote the welfare of the powerless. The intellectuals must cooperate with the uneducated. In short, it's all about cooperation. Cooperation between all people, wherever one lives and whatever social class you belong to. No one has privileges. It's all about the idea of universal brotherhood. How clearly this is reflected in the main call of the Theosophical Society, as is abundantly clear from the first writings of Theosophists, and as the masters also made clear in their letters. That main call is not so much the individual spiritual growth of members, but it is about serving humanity. And you do that best by providing knowledge about the laws of nature, knowledge about the essential unity of all that lives, which means that brotherhood is a fact in nature. And all this has to do with the fact that every human being, yes, every being, is essentially a noble being, a divine being. And therefore it's very, very important that people gain knowledge of the essential spiritual divine nature of man. Man is a latent God. HPB's first major book, I.S.I.S Unveiled, as well as the articles she published from 1879 onward in her magazine, The Theosophist, which she edited while in India, are preparatory ideas. She already alludes to the divinity of man, but the inherent divinity of every being was not really introduced clearly, very clearly, until her masterpiece, The Secret Doctrine of 1888, when she introduced, or rather reintroduced, the concept of the monad. In her earlier publications, she had mentioned this word on occasion, but in The Secret Doctrine, she elaborates it in a very grand manner. The term monad was already used by Pythagoras many centuries before our era, and after him there have been many philosophers who also use this word. The best known of them is probably Leibniz, who wrote a book entitled Monadology. In any case, HPB gives a clear vision of the monad. In The Secret Doctrine, she devotes dozens of pages to this subject. That notion is a logical consequence of the three fundamental propositions we have presented to you. The first proposition speaks of boundlessness, infinite space. In it, events take place periodically, the coming and going of universes, and those universes are called sparks of eternity, while each such spark is a monad and is as eternal as the fire from which it is the spark and from which it is actually never separated. On page 177, volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine, HPB defines a monad as one, universal, boundless, and imparted. We will explain this further in a moment. The third fundamental proposition of The Secret Doctrine concerns the fundamental equality of every soul with the oversoul, and about the obligatory pilgrimage of every soul, which is a spark of that oversoul. And with this, we have, in effect, the whole picture, albeit still in a vague outline. And this vague image needs to be fleshed out, dressed up, as it were. And therefore, let us zoom in on those sparks of eternity, those monads, which are one, universal, boundless, and imparted. They are eternal. So they have always been there. They have always been part of boundlessness, and therefore are themselves boundless. And because boundlessness cannot have an end point, they will always be there. They cannot be destroyed. They cannot be lost. Monads are spiritual, divine beings. They are the core of every manifested entity, from an atom to a god, from a plant or animal to a sun. Monads are centers of life, the imperishable core of one individual being. So also the core of a human being is a monad, which is not created, which is not made by a god, but has always been and will always be there. But more can be said about these monads. Well, let's look at where the word comes from. The word is derived from the ancient Greek monas, and that word means unity. And monas is again derived from monos, meaning one. Sometimes monad is translated as unique or indivisible unity. In the latter sense, it's a synonym of individual, Latin individuum, which also means indivisible. And this indivisibility, this undivided monad, should make us think. After all, everything we know is divisible. Even the atom, which was once thought to be indivisible, turns out to be made up of smaller particles, packets of energy. In the realm of consciousness, the manifested realm, everything we know you can divide. Everything is divisible. Our consciousness is composed. We can divide it in a number of states. Anyone can do that. We can recognize in ourselves different aspects of consciousness, different properties such as the feeling, desire, intellect, ability to understand. In short, in our outer world, we know nothing that is indivisible or imparted. Our world is characterized by diversity, not only between humans and animals, but within one human being, there is diversity. There is the material aspects, such as the physical body. There is the spiritual aspects, such as the awareness of the connectedness and unity of all life. There are, in short, spiritual and material aspects. In the monad, however, spirit and substance are one. And to understand this properly, you must realize that matter is in fact spirit in a lower form of expression. The monad knows no duality. It's homogeneous. It's the one. It's undivided. If something is undivided, then it apparently belongs to a world other than the one we know. Monads belong to that world where everything is one. And therefore, monads cannot differ from each other either. They are all God sparks, mathematical points of consciousness, which circumference is nowhere and whose core is everywhere. But what about that? Surely there are differences between humans and animals and plants. Certainly, those differences exist. How about this? Well, let's go a little deeper into what a monad is. I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to imagine such a monad. For how do you imagine something that has no circumference and whose center is everywhere? For us, note, for us, a monad is an abstraction. In fact, a monad exists for us, that is, it is observable only as soon as it connects and enters into cooperation with something else. Or more precisely, if it rolls something out of itself, if it emanates something, develops something out of itself, which does have a property or characteristic that we can discern. We just quoted HPB saying that a monad is one, eternal, boundless, and imparted. And then she continues. Pay attention. The rays, she says, the rays of a monad nevertheless form what we in our ignorance call the individual monads, plural, individual monads of man. In other words, out of that monad flow or radiate, use the verb you want, other monads. Try to understand this. It is not the case that the monad creates another monad. How could that be? Monads have always been there, but there is an attraction, collaboration, a similarity in characteristics, so that one monad attracts the other. Imagine a very rarefied aroma, so rarefied, so ethereal, that it appears in our field of perception only when limited by a veil or a shell. Well, that veil or shell comes from the monad itself. That veil is just as much a monad. But it takes shape, living in an atmosphere or world which is a little coarse, though still very ethereal. That monad arising from the monad gives form to the spiritual principle which we call buddhi. You recognize in the word, of course, the word Buddha. A Buddha is one who has fully identified with this Buddhic principle. You also call it the enlightenment principle. However exalted buddhi may be, it does have characteristics unlike the monad, very exalted characteristic. Of course, someone who identifies with buddhi understands the inextricable bonds of all life. The monad does not have properties. If therefore the monad did not develop buddhi, it is so abstract to us that it is beyond our ability to know. Therefore, in response to a question from a disciple, Mrs. Blavatsky answered, you can read it in the Secret Doctrine commentaries, that for us, the monad is not Atman, the self, the relatively highest principle in man, but buddhi. And this seems strange because often Atman is spoken of as being the monad, but it's a paradox, apparent contradiction, because of course Atman is too a monad, but it appears as it were only in our field of vision. It comes over the horizon, so to speak, when it emanates buddhi from itself. Now, buddhi is a principle of consciousness. That means it doesn't actually exist. The word principle means that something is an abstraction, just as, for example, the principle red or the principle yellow is an abstraction. Red by itself does not exist. Of course, there are red things, and the same goes for width or length, which also don't exist, but of course there are long and wide things. Buddhi is also such an abstraction, such an attribute that exists only because there is a being, a monad, who embodies, who shapes buddhi. So out of the monad comes a veil, another monad, a Buddha, a living Buddha. And that relatively highest monad, Atman it is called, and the Buddha together bring forth in the same way another monad, and that monad is called the higher human being. And that is not the personal being, not the personal man, but the higher man. And that higher man we also call the reincarnating ego. I don't want to confuse you with all kinds of terms, it's hard enough, But that term reincarnating ego is very telling because it is that element that survives death. And from that higher man flows another monad, the personal man. And that is the monad that we are manifesting right now. We identify with it. If somebody asks us who we are, we say our name and we say what country we are from and to what school we went to and what work we do. However, all of this is the personal ego. And that personal ego, note, that too, of course, is essentially a monad, emanates the animal ego, say for convenience, our instinctive consciousness, and finally, there is the carrier, the vehicle of this stream of consciousness, our physical body. So we are a combination of monads, a stream of life, a stream of consciousness containing different monads, all functioning and living on a different plane of existence, a different world, but at their core, they are all monads. Then what is the difference between the Buddha in me, or the God in me, and myself as personal ego? That's not the monad, because the monad are all the same. It is the difference in development of that monad. If you see the monad as an inexhaustible source of energies, of powers, of abilities, attributes, then it's obvious that one being has developed more of that monad than another. When we speak of evolution, the unpacking, the bringing out, the making active, the making manifest of faculties that are within the monad, but are not yet used, have not yet been developed. While the spiritual core of any being is the same of any other being. There is no essential difference between a God, a Buddha, a human being, an animal, a plant, a mineral. The difference is in the state of development. A baby latently has the same abilities, the abilities to think and to make choices as the adult. But in the baby, those abilities are still asleep. They have not yet been awakened. That will take place in the coming years. Well, that development is what HPB calls in the third proposition of the secret doctrine, the obligatory pilgrimage of every soul. And in a footnote, she says that by soul, she means monad. And on that pilgrimage, there are many stages. We call each stage a kingdom of a realm of nature. So at the bottom of the hierarchy are those monads who have yet to develop almost anything from themselves. We call them the elemental beings. They are the building blocks of the universe. The beings that have evolved a little more are the minerals, and further evolved are the plants, and then the animals, and then man. Are humans the end point of the development of the monad? Absolutely not. That would be an absurd thought. And well, for several reasons. First and foremost, how can a center of consciousness that is essentially limitless, boundless, knows an end stage? And further, it would be a very sad world if man at his present stage of development were the endpoint of the pilgrimage. Now, above the human realm, there are three more realms, three stages, the realms of the gods. And above those realms of the gods, there are nobler hierarchies, but they are so far beyond the horizon of our consciousness that we cannot say anything meaningful about them. Now, this growth from one phase to another takes place from our human perspective in huge time periods closely related to the life of planet Earth. Very generally, but there are certain exceptions to this. you can say that during the life of planet Earth, the monads have the opportunity to grow so much within the realm where they gain experiences, to develop to such an extent that they have learned everything within that realm. And when the planet reappears after a long period of rest, that is at the birth of a new planet, because planets also die and are born again. And remember the second proposition, cyclicity. So at the birth of the planet, a new planet, such a monad begins in a further developed realm of nature. He promoted himself to the next class of the lives. So, if we human beings do our best, for it is not an automatic process, then at the end of the life of the planet, we will have unfolded all the consciousness possibilities of the human being, of manas, as it is called in Sanskrit, the thinking consciousness, and therefore we will have become God man, divine man. Well, it is this perspective that is our powerful argument in the arena, because it satisfies the heart, head, and mind, and makes much more sense than the materialistic doctrine that there is only matter, or the doctrine that in God creates a soul at every birth. And contrary to what some claim, this theosophical idea is not hard to understand, I think. It's just different. It is the idea that life after life, creating causes and reaping consequences, we will develop more and more, we will awaken more and more of our noble aspects, learn to see how everything is interrelated and forms a unity. It is thanks to this idea that we express more and more of our inner divinity. Before we conclude and go to the study, I do want to clear up a possible misunderstanding in advance. When we say that the monads go from kingdom of nature to another kingdom, don't take it as if the monad descends to, for instance, the animal realm of the human realm. The monad is essentially boundless consciousness and always resides in its divine sphere. We already said that from the monad flows a stream of consciousness. That stream of consciousness forms an ego, a vehicle. It's that vehicle, the ego, which, depending on the development it is in, belongs to the mineral realm or the God realm or the human realm or whatever realm. The monad of me, the monad of an atom in my body or a God are equal to each other, are centers of consciousness. We do not differ in that. The difference is in the degree to which any being has impact, has developed the inherent abilities and qualities from that monad. You will come across terms like animal monad and personal monad and human monad in our theosophical literature. And if we know what is meant by it, it's okay to use these words, but realize that the monad is the same in an animal or in a human being. The only difference is that a human being has developed more at thinking consciousness with the associated self-consciousness than an animal. But the essence, the core of an animal, of a plant, a human being, a God, indeed of everything that lives and everything lives, is the same. Think about this, and you will find that the term, the essential unity of all life, is not an empty slogan. For in the heart of even the tiny atom, the flower wriggling out from between the asphalt, the ant in your garden, yes, that behind every living thing is that same divine power. No matter how far advanced the being may be on the path of evolution, or even if it's at the very, very bottom of the hierarchical ladder, its core is a God, an exalted center of consciousness, an infinite reservoir of powers and abilities. We live in a divine world. We are only spiritually blind and spiritually crippled and spiritually deaf because we have surrendered to the illusion of outer life. It is the idea of the spiritual background of all beings that should bring about a change in world thinking. Do you think that if a person had any sense of his or her spiritual core, he would put himself or his culture or his country first? Madness. He would realize that we are all rays of the same spiritual sun and that his well-being and his pilgrimage is hindered or encouraged by his brothers on the same path of development. In short, dear friends, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to realize that in our hearts we are divine beings. When you awaken that realization within you, you enter the arena and participate in a new world mentality. Well, we now have a short break, 3 minutes. After the break, there is some time for your questions, and then we will continue our study on Zoom. If you are not on Zoom yet, well, go to our website and ask for the Zoom link. Yeah, I see you soon. I see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back. Mariska, are there any questions?
No, there are not any questions yet in the YouTube chat or in the email. So I think everyone is saving them for the study.
So everyone is ready for our study.
I think so.
So we have some questions. So we are going to end with the Gayatri of the Rig Veda. That's an appeal to our monad, but the monad is called here the golden sun. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.